I got involved with Node really like the first week that it was released, and right away just loved it. I don't even want to say it was a small team. It was one person. But the real thing that sealed it for me was that every time I hit Control-C, it stopped. The competition for people's attention has never been crazier.
When a designer often approaches an open source project, sometimes it's just really hard to get the thing running.
The people who design the contribution process are the ones that are heavily engaged. You know, you have to get people to design a process that is not for them, it's for everybody else.
Hi, I'm Steve.
And I'm David, and you're listening to Don't Make Me Code, a bi-weekly series where we discuss developer experience and some of the unique challenges we face building developer-facing products.
Don't Make Me Code is brought to you by HeavyBit, a 9-month program for developer-facing startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com.
And if you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us at dmmc@heavybit.com or on Twitter @Don'tMakeMeCode.
Welcome to Don't Make Me Code. We're here with Mikeal Rogers, community manager at the Node.js Foundation, and we are going to talk about building communities today.
Awesome. Nice to be here. It's a beautiful, beautiful studio.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we were saying before the top of the show, you have some really interesting experience to both of us. I mean, building communities of developers around lots of products and companies, and you've been doing it for a long time now. And so I would be really interested just to get a history of you and how you got into this and why you do what you do.
Well, I think, when I was really young and started to get into computers, I ended up getting involved in the hacker community just because there was a community there and there were people online that I could kind of connect with about things. And so part of doing something and getting really into it to me has always been that community aspect. So when I actually started to work in software and build in software, there was a natural kind of attraction to do open source. So a little over 10 years ago now, I got a job basically doing full-time open source at the Open Source Applications Foundation at the time. And even there was just a huge draw to the kind of community aspect of it. So not just the development, but how do we get people to care? How do we get people engaged? What's the methodology there? How do we think about this? It's an amazing guy there called Ted Leung. He's kind of a guy behind the guy with a lot of Apache stuff and a lot of older open source, but he was amazing and was kind of a mentor. And then from there, worked at Mozilla and the CouchDB company and DigitalOcean and all over the place, really doing a lot of just open source work, a lot of community stuff, a lot of outreach, a lot of evangelism. And yeah, I think that's kind of my background as far as that goes. In terms of Node, I got involved with Node really the first week that it was released, and right away just loved it. And then to be involved in a community so early, you see a lot of kind of opportunity to do this and that, and to really bring people together and to drive things in a really positive direction. So I ended up doing a lot of that work until now. When the Node Foundation started, I was asked to come on and do community work in both kind of healing a fork and creating more sustainable practices around the contribution policies and that kind of stuff. And as that's done better and that's really working and is kind of phenomenal now, turning more of my focus to the foundation sort of internal execution around communications and events and a much kind of higher level role.
And so you were involved with Node even before there was an official foundation or really even official community around it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was released at a JSConf EU, which was a conference that my friend Jan Learnhardt was running. And so I knew that it was announced right away. I kind of watched the thing. I got I think an early video from Jan about it. That weekend, I asked just on Twitter, hey, has anybody written a proxy in this yet? Because nobody had written an HTTP proxy in Node yet. And I had spent 4 years working on an HTTP proxy in Python that was very, very smart and advanced and did all kinds of things to make it faster. And it was thousands and thousands of lines of code, really, and had all these dependencies and stuff. And it was just massive. But it was pretty quick. So I sat down and I went, I want to check out Node. I know how to write an HTTP proxy. I'll see, how far I can make it. And in 4 hours, I had a full HTTP proxy that was maybe 40 or 50 lines of code. And it was faster than my Python proxy. So that made it pretty easy to just be I don't think I'm going to write Python anymore. I'm probably going to write Node from now on.
That's an amazing story for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, it's a testament to the power of Node and the community around it, but also I mean, we talk about developer experience on the podcast, and that was what sold you.
Yeah. You know what it was more than anything? So it was very fast, and I didn't have to jump through a lot of the hoops to make it iterative and quick, kind of in I/O the way that I did in Python. But the real thing that sealed it for me was that every time I hit Control C, it fucking stopped. Like every time when you hit Control C in a node process, it actually ends. There's nothing that you can do to make it not end. At that point, there wasn't even a way to hook into an event to stop it, right? And Python, like I had so many, alternative threading libraries and to try and make Python just stop, like all these things called killable, whatever the module was that you were trying to do. And still you just could not get Python to stop sometimes. So that was really like the best piece of DX in the early days.
Wow. So they were able, for lack of a better word, they were able to land you that way. Mm. And then, you come on and help the community grow. Like, is that a showstopper ingredient to having a community, is having like a good developer experience and code base to start with?
Yeah. I think that's important to attract people. But I'm also a big believer in, especially when you're starting something new and you're building a community, people will show up to provide competencies that you show that you value, even if you don't have them, right? So if you have terrible DX, as long as you're really nice to people that show up to make it better, you'll attract people and those people will show up. And especially around something like a platform or a new language, like there are a million people that want to be the first people to write this particular thing. As long as they know that thing is valuable and that the community is going to embrace it, then people are going to show up to do it.
It's pretty interesting to me. So, we heard your story of like kind of how you started writing Node. I'm interested to hear, how did you go from there to actually working on the Node project itself? Like, what was the impetus for that?
Well, back then it was, a really, I don't even want to say it was a small team. It was one person. Like, Ryan Dahl was running the project and writing pretty much all of the code. And so there was some really early code around streams. Like, we were trying to unify the interface by which you would kind of iteratively process data, right? When Node was first released, it was actually really inconsistent. So if you wanted to say, take data from a file descriptor and send it to an HTTP thing, it was a totally different API that you would have to kind of mold between. And so, I wrote that Ryan had written an example of like, what it would look like to just kind of have a standard way to put these two things together. And so I wrote a patch that was just like, hey, here's a pump utility. So that's like part of Node. And then later Ryan just, made that, the dot pipe argument. So the dot pipe on streams, right? And back then it was really, you just send a pull request around. Maybe pull request didn't exist yet, but you just send a patch to Ryan on GitHub or maybe pull requests did exist, but they were like really shitty at the time. And so you would send the code to Ryan, and Ryan would look at it and talk to you and accept it. And especially that first year, there was probably about between 6 and 12 people that were in the San Francisco Bay Area that would get together periodically and really kind of like whiteboard out some of the more hairy parts of Node. And it was like me and Tim Caswell and Isaac Schluter and Ryan Dahl and Matt Ranney and Paul Querna and a couple other people that would, this was when Ryan was breaking the entire API for all Node programs every week, right? And there was a lot of iteration going on. So back then we would just kind of all get together and knock it all out.
I thought what you said about the values of the community was really interesting, that if you express a certain set of values, even if you don't have those skills, people will come to the project. How do you communicate that? Does that come across in code or in events?
It comes across in people's behavior more than anything. I think that there's a lot of things that you can do to a project that may seem like a really good idea that are actually kind of counter incentives for these kinds of contributions, right? So, for instance, like if you hand out commit bits to people that do code work or new API work, but you don't for tests or for documentation, you're not actually valuing that skill set. And so you're not going to grow a community there. You're not going to have a ladder for people to get more and more involved in the project. And you're not going to end up getting a lot of those people. A lot of the areas that, in the Node project where people said, nobody is ever going to show up to do this kind of stuff. It just sucks. We're going to have to pay somebody, are some of the biggest growth areas that we now have in the project, just because we decided to really value those skills at the same level that we value, somebody really understanding a crypto library. And I think to some extent, especially in the early days in the Node community, it was growing so fast that it created this vacuum, right? Like there was really nobody doing community events. And so when I stepped in to do a community event, there was a huge amount of like support for that and a lot of people that wanted to attend. And then because I did it in such a way that I wrote a lot about what it was like to run it and tried to help other people get them up and running and grew it. It was very helpful for other people to know that they had the support of somebody and like this some semi-established brand like NodeConf that they could also run an event with. And so we were able to grow the community event space that way.
And beyond the actual contributions, that part is really interesting. You disseminate this kind of cultural rule, if you will, like these are the things that are important to us right now. And so to get the community to grow, we want these kinds of contributions. But then I think that also touches on the process and politics and like how you as an organization go about getting people to contribute. Like how do you make the developer experience of contributing to the open source project better?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always even what you do, right? Like you can say like, these are my values, or these are the kinds of things that we would like to have people. But if other people don't care about them, that doesn't really matter. Like this is why Node.js doesn't have a roadmap right now, right? The reason that we don't have a roadmap is because we're not going to say, hey, these are the things that we care about, but we haven't written yet. Like the Node.js roadmap is whatever people show up and write code to do that actually makes sense to have on the Node platform. And it will land when it's ready, and it'll get released on a standard timeline that we have for major releases. And that's actually been a huge incentive for people to show up and do things that we didn't think that people would show up and do. And a lot of things that people thought were very, very important, it turns out that nobody actually cares about enough to write. So why have that blocking a bunch of other features in a roadmap, right?
That sounds like a really fantastic way of doing product prioritization, actually. If you have a community large enough to decide for you and they're able to contribute effectively, there's your roadmap.
Yep. And I mean, as long as there's not a lot of huge artificial barriers to contributing, then yeah, you're going to be able to grow a community really well that way. And also, I mean, like my favorite trick actually is that like if we want like a new microsite, or we want some kind of like new utility in the Node project, I will go in and I will write the worst code. Like, it'll barely work and it'll look terrible and it won't follow any kind of guidelines. And that's a great thing for other people. Like now there's a bunch of things for other people to do. Like if you want to get involved in this project, you can definitely clean up this code because it's terrible. And there's no, like a lot of people too, especially like once you're kind of established as a developer and people are sort of like, asking you to speak at conferences and stuff, people are like, is it okay if I touch this or okay? Like I make it bad enough that it's clear that, yeah, you can touch it and fix it. Like this is clearly not like intentionally this way.
Yeah, I remember hearing somewhere that the best way to get someone to answer a question is not to just ask the question, but to actually post an incorrect answer to it. And then you'll get a ton of people flooding in to correct you.
That's true. Yeah. And I mean, like the way that we treat pull requests in the Node project now is that the default is for every commit to land. And if it's not going to land, it's a process by which you say what needs to change or why it shouldn't land. It's not, the person submitting the code has to convince us that it should go in. It's, give us the changes that need to happen and why, and then this is the educational process. And every person that sends code, we don't think of as somebody smart enough or dumb enough to do this thing. We just think of it as like, if it's not right yet, then this is an educational opportunity for us to get them to the point where it is.
This is kind of sidetracking, but is there like, you want to probably keep things pretty lean and mean in the code, and like, do you ever have bloat issues that result from?
No. One of the reasons why we don't get this, and we don't think about it as much as code bloat as we do API bloat. Like we have a lot of API that we wish that we could get rid of that we will never be able to get rid of because people depend on it. So we're very, very cautious about taking on more stuff. And really, I mean, most of the value in Node is in the ecosystem. So the smaller that we can keep the core API and the more work that we can do around performance and basically stability, the better. So, I mean, the code base is growing, but a lot of it is like crazy performance optimizations. One of the reasons why I think people get into this is that if you have a BDFL model or you have a model where just a few people are kind of maintaining the project and a bunch of other people are sending them stuff, they feel like they're trying to review too much shit. And at some point, either they're telling so many people that they can't get in code that those people are going to wash out and not want to work on it anymore, or they're just going to have like, a lot of pending things and then just land them all at once. We've found that the more people that we bring into the decision-making body, which is like so hard decisions get made by the TC. Most things land without the TC getting involved, but if it's like controversial, the TC gets involved.
The TC?
Yeah, the technical committee. So the technical committee, so we've, in the Node project, since the foundation started, we went from about 5 to 70 committers. And then most commits land just, with an easy consensus between the committers that cared to review it. But like maybe 5% of contributions end up being a little bit more complicated, a little bit more controversial. They can't reach a consensus. It bubbles up to the TC, which is about 18 people that are, and that's constantly growing as well. And those people are just like more like relied upon deep decision makers, people that have a longer history with the project that we count on as like a tiebreaker. And the more that we expand that body, the less anxious they are to take on more API, right? Like the thing is like when you start to share the actual responsibility for something, people view everything that comes in as something of a liability. It's something that they're going to have to maintain for a while, and people are just a bit more cautious. And it's just a lot harder to get, 18 people to agree that this giant new feature is a good idea than it is, one person over drinks because at this conference they decided that it would be totally rad to add all of the Python standard library to something or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say, if nothing else, just getting a consensus among a growing number of people gets harder. And
I mean, we're still seeing contributions go up in general, and that's because we've made it really easy to get the things done that are supposed to happen. And also, I think that Node, at this point in Node's lifecycle, the community has a much better understanding of what is in the ecosystem and what is in core. And we're not really trying to grow core if we don't have to, right? Like we have an amazing ecosystem. Let's rely on it. Nobody has an application that only uses Node core and not stuff from NPM, right? Like that's not a thing. So we don't need to feel like we're competing with our own ecosystem with what goes into core.
So yeah, another thing, since you've been talking about the growth and the changes in the Node community over time, I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about the kinds of contributions that you're seeing and the changes there.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that's really changed in this kind of GitHub era of open source is that the majority of people partaking in open source don't identify as like open source people, right? Like there's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. And most of them are engineers that work at a startup or, they work at, what they're doing whatever. And this is like a part of their life is just sending a pull request every once in a while to a project that they depend on or logging an issue or whatever. And so when you look at the total number of commits that are happening on GitHub, the vast majority of them are actually happening from people that like have less than 100 commits a month, right? And it just grows as you go down that. So casual contributions account for, the largest amount and also the fastest growing amount of contributions that are happening in general in the ecosystem.
Is that partly, do you think, an offshoot of the package system? Like someone can write a single package like left pad and then, that's a relatively small contribution? And
I mean, JavaScript definitely has sort of a fatter tail than some of the other ecosystems, but this is like a open source wide trend on GitHub. This isn't just Node. I have a graph with this cut up by language, and it's not just Node and JavaScript. Like it's almost everywhere, and that small package thing is certainly true in Node, but also, I mean, GitHub made it easy to make a repository and to make a project, right? And also to collaborate between projects. So, I mean, rewind like 10 years ago, right? And say like you depended on an open source project and you wanted to get code in. Well, you might have to learn a new version control manager. You were definitely going to have to learn an entire new contribution flow and how to get that commit in. You're going to have to figure out where to send it. You might have to sign the CLA. You might have to like read a giant amount of docs on just like how to configure and pull it down. And every project is different. So there's not a transferable skill set between all these projects either, right? So, it was very hard to get involved in open source. Like the barrier to entry was very high. That's why everybody involved in older open source identifies as an open source person, because like part of the barrier to entry was also like adopting like a philosophy and a set of like, values. Now, just people in software in general are involved in public software. Like they're working and doing things on GitHub and are engaged in some way. And, if you really want to have a sustainable project nowadays, you really have to gear more towards these casual contributions. You have to gear towards people that may not show up again, that may show up just to do 4 lines or whatever. You can't have a bunch of big barriers to entry in the way. And this is a really hard thing for projects to do because the people who design the contribution process are the ones that are heavily engaged. They're not the ones that are casually engaged. So you have to get people to design a process that is not for them. It's for everybody else.
So it's interesting, I've noticed this a lot with the open source work I've done too, where you talk about this sort of fat tail or long tail of contributions. Like that's definitely a trend. I guess I'm sort of curious, how much time do you spend actually trying to design a process whereby some of those people can become more serious contributors or even maintainers or part of this technical committee? Or is it kind of just expected that some of these people are just going to come by and give one commit and disappear?
Yeah. I mean, you have to be okay with them leaving, but retention should definitely be a goal, right? you want some amount of them to stay around and to continue to level up. I mean, this is definitely a goal with the Node project, and at every level we've grown and had more people. There's a small kind of chart that I have in an article that I wrote called Healthy Open Source, but it basically says that like as your user base is growing, the list of people that you can identify as contributing in some way needs to be growing, and then also the people that can review that needs to grow, and also the people that can handle higher order decision making needs to grow. And all of these, like, you're probably looking at an order of magnitude between each of these steps, but they all need to grow in proportion to each other, or else you're going to burn out some amount of those people. In the Node project, like this has gotten really difficult because the size of the project has grown. So there's not all of this is entirely transferable if you have like a single small project. But one of the things that we did that was really effective was that we started to cut up the project into more slices, including things that traditionally maybe wouldn't have been a community resource. So like the website, for instance, like we're the only project that's involved with the Linux Foundation that like our community runs our own website. But the website is like a great place for people to initially get involved, right? There's a lot of people coming that know how to do some kind of web development, to see something that they can change. And that's really their first kind of entry point. And there's also an evangelism working group where people just write blog posts and try to promote Node. There's two buckets of barriers to entry. Some are technical and some are cultural, right? So part of it is that people are just worried about being vulnerable and like trying to get involved with these people, or how to get involved with these people and how to acclimate to this culture and if they'll be accepted. And then there's all of the actual technical stuff, like I don't know how to do this, I need to learn it. So having like an area like a website or like an evangelism working group where people can acclimate to the cultural side, and then all they have to do is learn the technical stuff to get more involved, we see a lot of people make that path. And in fact, I mean, one of the earliest people like came in through the website, got involved in core, like messing with tests, I think, and then just started taking on more and more stuff. And now he's like on the TC for core. And I think she may have been the first female committer ever in the Node project. Came through the evangelism working group to the website to core, I think, on docs, and is now like getting more involved as well. So you see people break through these barriers that way, and it's really, really good to see. And also cutting things up this way allows us to vary the contribution process a little bit between each one, right? So, for instance, in the Node project, there's this very sophisticated kind of branch structure because we everything lands in master and then we port them off to these branches. So the cleanliness of like the sign off messages and all of that, like in order to make this actually work, we have to have some cleanliness there, and that is a barrier to entry. Like it's one that we have to kind of live with, and that we have a lot of like onboarding and documentation and kind of soft skills to get people through. But it is a barrier. But like on the website, master deploys. Like who cares? Like I don't care if it's what kind of merge that you do, or like anything else. Like we're not really worried about the cleanliness of the commit logs and stuff like that, and in the same way that we are around core. And so that's another like lower barrier to entry for people to get more easily involved, and then from there we can easily level them up.
So you talked about growing the community and growing the foundation, and also having a healthy organization around it being a critical part of that you can't really have a healthy community without a healthy company or organization behind it. And so how do you ensure the health of the organization and making money, basically?
Well, yeah, I mean, it also depends. I mean, we tend to talk about, the 1% of open source projects, right, that, like, need this kind of infrastructure. I mean, most open source projects are, like, a library that a bunch of people use that maybe 10 people will contribute to. Like, this is the majority of what's going on out there. And that's all really valuable. But yeah, for the projects that really do need some kind of institutional support for whatever reason, or, a project just becomes enough of its own ecosystem that people are depending on it in a way that they can't rely on a single company anymore, so they need a foundation or some kind of neutral body that's going to outlive it, some other company when they get involved. There's a lot to talk about there, and it really depends on the project, to be honest. Like, I mean, the way that the Node Foundation is structured is very different than, say, like the Free Software Foundation or the OSI, right? Like most of our budget goes to marketing and PR because we're competing with Java and we're competing with proprietary platforms that are huge, and we really want, like, it's good for our community for Node to win, and in order for Node to win, like we're going to have to spend money on these more traditional areas. And so our structure makes a lot of sense, and that's why we're very, very different than the Python Software Foundation, for instance. Like very, very different. Like But that's our particular need. And that's also why we have this giant wall between the foundation board and the technical side, so that the technical side, the committers and the contributors can own the project. And they really do have a wall for all of their decision-making authority between them and like the foundation's board.
And so what would your advice be then to a company that's starting out trying to build a business on top of open source software?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends on your relationship to it, right? I mean, I think all businesses are built on open source, right? All technical businesses are built on open source. Like, there's nobody who's not relying on open source in some way. I think that you need to understand like how closely your business is tied to this open source project or an open source platform or community, right? Like, Instagram was highly dependent on Postgres and Python, but if those technologies failed overnight, like they wouldn't necessarily fail overnight. Like they had a product, but if you're Cloudera, like you're heavily tied to this one particular open source project, so you probably need to take like more responsibility for it and make sure that it's like in a really particular place. So, yeah, I mean it really, really depends. I've seen it go every way that it can go. The one rule that I would say is that if a company is supporting an open source project, right, like it is paying for the majority of developers, or it is providing the majority of the leadership in some way, the company needs to be able to scale its investment with the growth of that community. And so you start to see tension take over when the company or at least their investment in that project is not growing at the same rate that the community is growing, right? Node had a pretty famous kind of thing with the contributors and Joyent, who was owning it at the time, with the IO.js fork and everything. And a lot of that really just came down to like no company's growing as fast as Node is growing, like, or at least at the time. And so no company could ever keep up with the level of investment that you had to do with something that was growing like that and still growing like that. So yeah, I've seen it go many, many ways. And I mean, Joyent eventually just, did the right thing and put it in a foundation. And now the foundation isn't scaling, the amount of money that comes into the foundation with the growth of the community. What we are doing is that we're scaling the community with that, right? So the community is now running the project, and the project can grow contributors as fast as the community around Node is growing. So what happens more often than that, though, is like, a company shows up to a project and they go, we need to build a community around this. we need to grow a community. We don't have one. And that's a really awkward position to be in, right? Where, it's your responsibility to make people excited about this. Guy Kawasaki, who's sort of like the original evangelist for software, right? He has this great saying that's, everything that is gold, Guy touches, which is very different than everything Guy touches is gold, right? Which is that he doesn't try to evangelize things that aren't amazing. I think that you have a lot more control over that when you're a developer-focused company and you're working on an open source project, because if it's not gold and it's not great, you can fix it, right? Like you can actually make it better and make it more attractive. And you need to meet people where they are, right? Like you need to go like, who are the people that would care about this and why don't they? I think databases have the hardest problem with this. And I say this with love because I worked in the database world for a while, but it's so many times like a regular developer, like a web developer, it's like, so wait, so why do I have to care about like, CouchDB or this or that? And the answer from the other side is like, let me explain the cap theorem to you. And then you just immediately lost them, right? Like this is why MongoDB won this whole fight, right? Because they didn't try to explain the cap theorem to people. They just assumed that they wouldn't know it and then just, didn't write things to disk sometimes.
And so that, because it's gotten so much easier to contribute to projects like this, because there are so many more projects available, is that the downside? What is the downside of this, enormous growth of?
Oh yeah. I mean, the competition for people's attention has never been crazier. No, you have to really put it out there. I mean, you're not only competing with other projects for attention, you're competing with like, well, why don't I just fuck around and do my own thing? Right? With the LevelDB ecosystem inside a Node, like I could just sit down and write my own database. Like, why do I want to run your database? And especially like on GitHub, like a lot of the activity is like, in people's own repos, just doing their own thing. So they have the skills to contribute to your project. And if people are using your project and there is like some momentum behind it, there's a lot of incentive for people to get involved. Like the majority of the reason why people don't get involved is just that it's actually hard to contribute to. And there's a lot of things that you can't see because you're so invested in it and you're working on it all the time that are making it really hard for other people to get involved. And it's really hard to step away from that and recognize that.
Did Node or any other community you've been involved with have designers involved early on, or was it purely developers?
No, not that I can think of. I mean, people have come to the Node project and done various like little design work and stuff like that. I mean, we've had fun with it. In the IO.js days, we said like, hey, what are people's crazy logo ideas? And then thread just blew up with just, most of them were totally just hilarious and unusable. And there was so much like passion there that we just said, we're not going to pick a logo. Like we're just going to use a random logo every time that we're just going to pull one out of here whenever we need a logo for something. and like that was really fun for like the short amount of time that IO.js was not merged into Node. I can't think of any projects where designers were really, really heavily involved. I mean, like designers show up and provide that skill set all the time. Again, like if you value it, people will show up. People have shown up to, do design work on the Node website, and my library request got like a logo just because we put it on Twitter like, hey, we'd love to have a logo, and people do that. But the thing about design skills, right, is that so often a project only needs a designer for a certain amount of time. It's not like a skill set that like has to stay around indefinitely. And so they don't stick around enough to be like in a decision-making role, which is unfortunate. Like I wish that there was a better way to work on that. I'll think about that one, actually. That'd be nice.
Yeah, it came up in our last conversation how, I mean, like you've been saying that there aren't many designers contributing to open source software. And I think part of it is the finite nature of the need. But there are some of us who have been involved as product designers for a long time who maybe could make substantive contributions to, the nature of the project or like the way the developer experience of the tool set is created.
Yeah. I think a lot of projects probably do have a hard time valuing the skill set, though. Like, honestly. I mean, everybody's a backseat designer, like on the internet, right? Like, everybody has an opinion about this thing. And that becomes really, really difficult to manage. Like, and, when I was at OSAF, this is like a decade ago, but, it was an open source project run by a foundation, and then we had a community kind of design process. But what that essentially ended up meaning was that the designer just spent all of her time explaining her UX workflows to a mailing list.
To a committee.
Right. And well, it wasn't even a committee. It was just like, it was a consensus-seeking process. But when you're paid full-time to send emails, you're always going to win. And you're generally just going to be annoyed with people asking you the same thing over and over again. So it didn't actually, it was open. I wouldn't call it participatory.
It is interesting, though, thinking about like how do designers contribute to open source in general. I mean, like you mentioned, we talked about this in our last episode a little bit, and part of the thing that we talked about was that when a designer often approaches an open source project, sometimes it's just really hard to get the thing running or like figure out where to even start or how to contribute to begin with. And so there's probably something we can be doing better there for sure to encourage or those types of contributions.
Yeah, I mean, as you work your way up the kind of skill set chain, barriers to entry become more and more and more of a problem, right? So with the designer, it's going to be more of a problem than like somebody who you want to come and work on the crypto stuff, right? Like people who understand how crypto libraries work are not going to be like, how do I use pull requests? But you may actually get that from a designer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you've now achieved a level with Node where you not only have a community around the language, but you also have a conference, several conferences. And
we have a community of conferences.
So how do you manage that next level of community?
Well, I mean, I think that the Node conferencing has changed with the changes in Node, right? And as Node has grown, the needs of the community have changed. And so, like, conferences show up to fill those needs. Like, if you're thinking about doing an event for something that you're into, you really got to go like, why am I doing this? It's amazing how many people don't actually ask themselves that question and run a conference. Like you see a lot of product conferences, like products that aren't platforms, right? Like where like you can use it and you can't there's no API, like you can't build some stuff on top of it. Like you just use it and people will build a conference around it because, Slack has a conference or what, like whoever else that you wish that you were has a conference. I mean, really, like a conference it's a beautiful thing when you do it right and you have a mission, right? So if there's a need in the community that is not filled, right? Like we have a community, we can define this community, and bringing people together will allow us to do something that we can't do online. And a lot of the time is just, creating tighter bonds between those people by getting them together. That's why unconferences are still a thing, right? Is that, you don't actually need formal talks and catering in order to get people to connect with each other. But I think in the early days of Node, I was focused a lot on opening up people's idea of what Node was and the breadth of Node and the identity of Node, because people most attracted to the project in the earliest days, and then also the people that shepherded it on for a while were really interested mainly in back-end stuff. And really early on, that started to shift. There was IoT, there was a lot of stuff that fell outside of that identity that people were doing with Node. So I worked a lot on that and continued to work on it, and now that's actually part of the identity of Node inside of the foundation is this Node everywhere thing where we're talking about that. But in those early days, that was why I was doing kind of talks. And then it shifted a little bit more into educational stuff. And also Node was growing so fast that I could not run enough events for all these people. And so I started, writing a lot more about how to run an event. And then other people ran events and I supported people running those events. And now there's a bunch of people running those events.
Oh, wow. So you created a framework for other people to run events too.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I wish that there was more support, but it's much more complicated than you can imagine to give support to somebody in Brazil running an event. I can't, offer them, my LLC to help it set up anything or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, one is just sitting down and talking with them, and they'll ask a bunch of questions and you just kind of answer them. When I ran my first event, Chris Williams from JSConf worked with me and basically did this for me. And so when people started asking me, it was okay, I need to do this because Chris did this for me. And Chris is still doing it for a bunch of other people as well. So I can't pawn them off on him. But yeah, so there was this real kind of community-led effort to do a bunch of small events in a bunch of places. And small events are interesting because they attract the people that are kind of most invested in the community. And so the social ties part of it, the actually connecting with people part of it is really, really strong. And I'm glad that we went in a direction that was almost all of these events are single track. Almost all of them are really intimate, really big breaks. We really prioritize that. I think that now Node is at a place where you can't do one big community event because there's just too many people. And events have gotten much more regional, right? So there's a lot of smaller events now that are really great for all of these communities, and they pull in people like me to speak or whatever just to get people there.
I like that model too, because Amazon, by contrast, has this massive Reinvent with it's so big, it's impossible for a small company to get involved in an event like that. And
Yep.
So more smaller events seems to be a better way to get more people involved.
Yep. And I think you also do need those big events like Reinvent though. They address a totally different set of people, right? The Node Foundation now runs 2 events called Node Interactive, which are 1,000 people events, right? One in Amsterdam and one in Austin this year. And the amazing thing about that event is that it gets a bunch of people like me and a bunch of other core committers to Node because we do a board meeting and a couple of committer things there, and we have them speak. But they also get to meet all of these people that write Node all day, every day, but they sit behind a desk. They don't talk on GitHub. They're Node users. They're part of our community, but we have no other access to them because unless their company buys a lot of 50 tickets and sends all of them, they're not going to show up. And and a lot of those companies that are building all of this stuff around Node really need to connect with those people as well. And so it's a totally different purpose. I wish that it had a different name because it's literally that different. The only thing that's the same is that you're bringing people together, but the goals are just totally different. And I think that they're both really important to have, and they need to be structured really, really differently.
What you said about the unconference I thought was also interesting, that it's not just that getting people casually together is important, but that you can run entire events that way and that they have just as much value.
Oh yeah. I mean, some of the most valuable things that we've ever done have been on conferences. I think the Node Streams API and I think the Domains API, all these things were worked out in a summer camp in Marin where I do NodeConf.
Yeah, NodeConf. Yeah, I saw that this one too is going to be up in Marin.
Yeah, NodeConf Adventure that we do up there. And it's a little unconference. This is the last one, but yeah, it's been great.
And so the people that are coming to that are very like heavy contributors for the most part, or the people that are deeply involved?
Traditionally, yes. I mean, we've always tried to broaden it a little bit and get more people out. But the reality is that like you're not going to go and sleep in the woods with a bunch of people from a community that you're just like a little bit into, right? Like that's not a thing that people do. You're not going to like, sleep on bunk beds in a summer camp for kids. Like if you're not pretty into it.
That's funny. This all sounds so obvious as you say it now, but I've never really heard someone explain this all rationally before. Like, the giant event where you have multiple tracks and talks, like those are educational events and you try to bring the masses in. And it's just really interesting to hear about all that and the stratification.
Yeah, and one of the things that we can do as a foundation that I think if a media company or just a for-profit corporation is running like a giant event like that, is that they're just there to make the technology grow and to get more people from the business world like involved and engaged in it, and that's certainly a goal that we have. But also like we can think about each of these people that sit behind a desk all day as a potential future contributor and a potential like future person that is much more engaged in the community than they are now, and so we can gear the content and some of the engagement in such a way that we kind of pull them in that direction, because that's part of our mission and one of the reasons why we exist. So it's not purely just oh, well, what are people asking for? Let's give them that. There's also like a healthy dose of like people probably also need this, and it would be good for the community if we did this.
The one we kind of touched on the relationship between a few times, like the business and an open source project. And I still feel like there's a missing conversation around how, like David, your use case, basically, like you're trying to build a company on top of an open source platform that you're creating.
Yeah, and it's different. Like there's different kinds of open source, right? Like there's something like Node, which is like a giant community of contributors now, and then there's something like Convox where we essentially bootstrapped the project. We built most of the code. We've now opened it up to the community, and we're starting to see some participation from other people, but still the bulk of the work is done by us. Yeah,
and I mean, it really, really depends. And like, is your community mainly going to be on the user side, or is it mainly going to be on the developer side, right? Like, do you need a ton of people engaged in the core of it, or do you really need people building on top of it and building a platform on top of it, and that's where you need your engagement? Because you need a pretty different strategy for each of those things, right? And you need to figure out what you're going to optimize for. I mean, like if you're optimizing for people to build on top of it, then you're going to optimize a lot for saying no to things, right? Like you want them to be built on top and not in it. And then you're really just going to be taking all of this feedback for features that people want into like, oh, well, how do I make that something generally applicable to a bunch of people and allow people to build that on top of me? It really varies between them, right? I think that the most important thing really is just that it's participatory. I mean, like you want to encourage participation at all the levels that you can in order to compete. And I mean, open source is it's more and more of a loaded term every day. But open source is a license, and so much of what we talk about usually when we say open source is really we're talking about participation. We're talking about collaboration to some extent, and that's really the marker of like a project that is growing and healthy versus one that's not. But I mean, at the end of the day, like it's whatever works for you and your community. I mean, there are a lot of people, totally happy that, to use Go and to never, ever be able to get any real changes into Go if you don't work at Google. A lot of people don't there's a ton of people that don't mind that. Like they're okay with that relationship. And Google is putting a ton of resources into Go. So if you agree with that direction, it's not like they're leaving you hanging out to dry. But there is like a lack of participation from people outside of Google and Go in the core of it. And there's a huge amount of participation in people building on top of it, right? And a lot of people building great libraries and applications on top of it. So yeah, I mean, it's to some extent it's what are you optimizing for. I think, for me, what I've tended to work on is cases where the community growth is outstripping what can be sustained by whatever the structure is underneath. And so you have to kind of break apart that structure and make it more participatory. And in some cases also you've got to bring it into like a neutral body. Like you're a victim of your own success. Like if enough businesses depend on you for their business, then they need to know that technology is going to outlast a business.
Yeah, they're going to stop trusting you as an individual entity.
Yep. Yeah, you can be too successful.
is there a clean line somewhere? Like hearing you talk about the distinction between contributing to core versus building on top, that when I, just off the top of my head, when I think of businesses built on top of open source software that they've created, I see a lot more of the companies where they're managing the core and then people are building on top. Whereas Node or other communities where people are actively contributing to core, those seem to go more the foundation route.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that most successful businesses optimize for growth, right? And if you're a platform, you can grow quicker than you can invest in it. Maybe not your value, but the value of the platform can grow much quicker than you grow the business around it, right? So like look at something like Slack, right? Like Slack makes no qualms about the fact that they are a platform. And that I think they even said recently that like their goal is that the value on top of it is worth more than Slack is, right? That's a very specific thing that they're trying to do. And with Node, the value on top of it is hugely valuable and shared by a ton of different companies. And so for Node, it needs to be in a body that is neutral, that is not, particularly around one company. And there are other analogous platforms as well. But yeah, I mean, if you're building a new business, like a brand new one, and especially if you're not in, like there isn't another company or another piece of software in between you and your customer, it's much more natural to have a slightly tighter grip of control on it. I think one of the problems that you have though is just like the growth thing, right? Like how are you going to grow to meet all of these needs? Like are you going to invest all of those resources, or is a community going to build around like doing those resources? And as that community grows, if you can't grow the investment that you're putting into it, then you're going to end up getting into a tension situation.
There's this one looming, like the last thing on the board there, the fake it till you make it. I know, well, I guess we kind of touched on that, just like you have to kind of create inertia however you can. And I don't know if you have more to say about that specifically. Like how, was there any early effort at Node or any other place that you've been to really spark inertia by getting a team to,
So let's talk a little bit about like the evangelism side of that, right? Because I do think that's important when you're promoting something. Like when you're promoting something, you're not talking about how many people aren't using it. You're talking specifically about the people that are using it and how rad it is and how positive it is. But also when you're building a community, you're really only talking about the positive stuff. Like, and in fact, like if you're trying to build a community by flaming something else or saying that you're better than it, like don't. You're going to attract like a lot of really negative people and people that have a really high tolerance for negativity, which is really going to screw you up down the line. Like always stay positive. Like that's the number one rule is like always stay positive. Always be saying positive things about yourself, about your community, about other people doing stuff. Part of fake it till you make it in terms of evangelism is like just talk about the people doing cool stuff, even if it's not that big a deal. Like and make it be a big deal. Make it like an interesting story that people care about. It could be one startup doing some stuff with 5 people and sure, like you're not Java, you're not like in some giant data center somewhere serving 1 million people, but like you could be and you might be someday. And like here the path to that is a bunch of other people like getting engaged and inspired by the stories of people like actually using your software.
Yeah, and as a small company, I think it's really important to elevate people so that they feel important, and at whatever scale you're at, it does seem like that's how you grow, not just by staying positive, but also by celebrating the level that you're at and making sure that you're helping everyone along with you.
Exactly. I mean, like this is a really small thing, but like one of the things that I started doing in requests when I realized like I did not have enough time to continue maintaining this library was like people would send a really good pull request that was like really solid, and I'm like, that's awesome. You commit this now. You can commit. Please do that. And so it's not just saying like, oh yeah, you can get in stuff. Like, hey, let's just commit or no. Just like here, you do it now. You are now the expert on this. And like deferring to people when they know things, like deferring to like your community to ask about a thing on, even if it's just on social media, right? If somebody asks about like, oh hey, this thing, like you might know the answer, but if somebody else knows it really well or is really proud about it, like point them at them and elevate them as well.
Thanks again to our guest, Mikeal Rogers, for joining us. And Mikeal, if people want to get in touch with you, how do they find you online?
Just go on Twitter. I'm Mikeal. That's how you spell my name.
All right. Thanks again for being here, and we'll see you next time on Don't Make Me Code. That's about all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you have a DX topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us at dmmc@heavybit.com or on Twitter @Don'tMakeMeCode.
To learn more about HeavyBit, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out the library.
It's packed with amazing talks from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders.